Hi, my name is Reagan. Welcome to the Twisted States podcast. Thank you for joining us for episode 4 in our first season of Twisted States, where each week we take a look, state by state, at some of America's most nefarious killers, elusive cryptids, and bizarre mysteries. This week, we're headed to the Golden State. Good old California. California was the 31st state to join the Union on September 9th, 1850. Of course, California is the home of Hollywood, the world's largest and oldest film industry. California is also home to 4 of the world's 10 largest companies by market capitalization and 4 of the world's 10 richest people. The California Gold Rush took place between 1848 and 1855, and all of that started out at Sutter Mill, which is near Coloma. It's about 36 miles northeast of Sacramento. So one of the workers working on John Sutter's land found gold, James Marshall, while he was out in the field. And when he discovered the gold, he was like, went to John Sutter and he's like, hey, check it out, And John swore everybody to secrecy. He said, look, my angle here is agriculture. I'm really focusing on this agriculture corridor thing. I don't mention the gold. I don't want that. We need to stay very tight-lipped about this. Well, of course, he had a worker named Charles Bennett. And Bennett, well, he wasn't so good at keeping secrets. He really honestly told anybody and everybody he encountered. And he had to go make a trip to go meet with some officials, once again, surrounding the whole agricultural corridor thing. And yeah, he just flapped his lips all over the place and told everybody. Yeah, it really had quite an impact on how that would, shape the future for California. What we're here to talk about today, though, is William Holland and the St. Francis Dam disaster. So William Holland was the chief engineer working on the project for the dam. He designed it. He had a lot of hand in it. So I want to go back and take a look at him as a person, aside from all of this, and get a little bit of background on him before we get into the tragedy. So William Holland was born September 11th, 1855, to parents Hugh and Ellen in Belfast, Ireland. The following year, they'd be blessed with another son named Hugh Jr. Shortly after, they relocated to Hugh and Ellen's hometown of Dublin. At the age of 7, William's mother passed away, leaving Hugh with the 2 boys to handle independently. William's life wasn't on a very even keel at this point. Losing his mother at such a young age, then his father getting remarried, because we all know having step-parents can be just as tricky as being a step-parent. Some people get lucky, but it can still prove challenging, even in the best of situations. Anyway, his grades started to fail, and his father Hugh responded to this poorly by beating William, but he came to the realization he didn't have to stick around and take that kind of treatment anymore. Mulholland ran away to sea and joined the British Merchant Navy at age 15. After several transatlantic voyages, William decided to disembark in New York in 1874 and explore the Americas. He had his heart set on eventually making it to California. It took him roughly 3 years to make it there. William worked many odd jobs around the country. He even caught up with his little brother at one point, and they attempted to stow away on a ship headed for Los Angeles, but they were caught in Panama and forced off the boat. He was determined, though, so in 1877 he finally worked his way across country and stepped foot in L.A. Upon arrival, Mulholland was a bit disappointed at the lack of job prospects. L.A. was growing quite exponentially, but it was still a meager town of only about 9,000 residents, so it wasn't as booming as many of the larger port towns he had encountered during his time at sea. William debated going back to work on the sea, but he slowly started to find his way after taking several odd jobs and eventually crossing paths with Frederick Eaton. Eaton was head of the local water company and hired Mulholland as deputy zanjero, meaning he maintained the Zanja Madre. This original aqueduct brought water to the Pueblo de Los Angeles from the Los Angeles River. Thus began Mulholland's involvement with helping to find solutions to the ever-growing population of LA's water issues. William continued to bounce around a bit more during this time. He became a naturalized citizen of the U.S. during that span of time as well. And 4 years after that, with the formation of the Los Angeles Water Department, Mulholland was signed on as superintendent. In 1911, the Water Department was renamed the Bureau of Water Works and Supply. with Mulholland named its chief engineer. William had no formal schooling when it came to engineering. He was considered self-taught. Now, to be fair, there's nothing wrong with being self-taught and not having a formal education in many professions. He studied several books relevant to his field and was building considerable hands-on experience. But when so many lives can be put on the line, maybe a little better understanding of your field might be in order. Anyway, Mulholland envisioned Los Angeles growing much more prominent. However, he recognized the limiting factor to the growth of Los Angeles was its water supply, because it had a semi-arid climate with unreliable rainfall. If you don't get the water, you won't need it, Mulholland famously remarked. Mulholland shared the vision of a much larger Los Angeles with Frederick Eaton. Eaton became city engineer around the same time Mulholland became superintendent of the water company. When Eaton was elected mayor of Los Angeles, he converted the water company to city control in 1902. Mulholland's public works program began to irrigate large areas of previously arid land. Within a decade, the city's population had doubled from just 50,000 in 1890 to more than 100,000 in 1900. 10 years later, it had tripled to almost 320,000. Eaton and Mulholland realized that a gravity-fed aqueduct could deliver a large amount of runoff from the Sierra Nevada in Owens Valley to Los Angeles. From 1902 to 1905, Eaton, Mulholland, and others engaged in underhanded methods to ensure that Los Angeles would gain the water rights in the Owens Valley, blocking the Bureau of Reclamation from building water infrastructure for the residents in Owens Valley. While Eaton engaged in most of the political maneuverings and deceit, Mulholland misled Los Angeles public opinion by dramatically understating the amount of water available for Los Angeles' growth. Mulholland also misled residents of the Owens Valley. He indicated that Los Angeles would only use unused flows in the Owens Valley, but all along the plan was to use the full water rights to fill the aquifer of the San Fernando Valley. In 1906, the Los Angeles Board of Water Commissioners appointed Mulholland the chief engineer of the Bureau of the Los Angeles Aqueduct. From 1907 to 1913, Mulholland directed construction of the 233-mile Los Angeles Aqueduct. The project required 3,900 workers at its peak and involved digging 164 tunnels. Construction began in 1908. Many compared the complexity of the project to the building of the Panama Canal. Finally, water from the Owens River reached a reservoir in the San Fernando Valley on November 5, 1913. At a ceremony that day, Mulholland spoke his famous words about this engineering feat. "There it is. Take it." The aqueduct carries water from the Owens Valley in the eastern Sierra to irrigate and store water in the San Fernando Valley. When the trench was built, the San Fernando Valley was not part of the city. Thus, from a hydrological perspective, the San Fernando Valley was ideal. Its aquifer could serve as free water storage without evaporation. However, one obstacle to the irrigation was the Los Angeles City Charter, which prohibited the sale, lease, or other use of the city's water without two-thirds approval by the voters. This charter limitation would be avoided by annexing a large portion of the San Fernando Valley to the town. Mulholland realized that the annexation would raise the debt limit of Los Angeles, which allowed the financing of the aqueduct. By 1915, the initial annexations were completed, and by 1926, the land area of Los Angeles had doubled, making it the largest city in the United States by area. The historical relationship between water and the rapid urbanization and growth of Los Angeles is the basis for the fictional plot of the 1974 film Chinatown. The water from Mulholland's aqueduct also shifted farming from wheat to irrigated crops such as corn, beans, squash, and cotton. Orchards of apricots, persimmons, and walnuts, and major citrus groves of oranges and lemons. These continued within the city environs until the next increment of development converted land use into suburbanization. A few enclaves actually still remain, such as the groves at the Orchid Ranch Park and CSUN campus. Mulholland became the first American civil engineer to use hydraulic sluicing to build a dam while constructing the Silver Lake Reservoir in 1906. This new method attracted the nationwide attention of engineers and dam builders. Government engineers adopted the strategy when building Gatun Dam, on which Mulholland was a consultant, in the Panama Canal Zone. In 1914, the University of California, Berkeley, awarded Mulholland an honorary doctorate. The inscription on the diploma read, in Latin, but I'm going to translate it to English because I can't read Latin and I don't feel like embarrassing myself right this moment. The translation was, "He broke the rocks and brought the river to the thirsty land." Mulholland's public profile continued to grow. His offices were at one point on the top floor of Sid Grauman's $1 Million Theater. He was even a favorite to become mayor of Los Angeles. When asked if he was considering running for office, he replied, "I'd rather give birth to a porcupine backward." So Holland, despite a tumultuous childhood and being forced out on his own at a young age, really made a name for himself. Of course, some of his tactics were abhorrent and rather underhanded when helping solve LA's water issues. Still, he was fighting hard for something he believed in and proved to be somewhat innovative in many ways in the world of civil engineering. Sadly, it seems his confidence and the blind faith of others around him would prove to be deadly. While building Los Angeles Aqueduct, Holland first considered sections of San Francisco Canyon as a potential dam site. He felt that there should be a reservoir of sufficient size to provide water for Los Angeles for an extended period in the event of a drought or damage by an earthquake to the aqueduct. In particular, William favored the area between hydroelectric power plants, powerhouses number 1 and number 2, with what he perceived as favorable topography. A natural narrowing of the canyon downstream of a broad upstream platform would create a large reservoir area with minimal possible dam. A large camp had been set up to house the workers near the area, and Holland used his spare time becoming familiar with the area's geological features. In the site where the dam would later be situated, he found the mid and upper portion of the western hillside consisted mainly of a reddish-colored conglomerate and sandstone formation with small strings of gypsum interspersed within it. Below the red conglomerate, down the remaining portion of the western hillside, crossing the canyon floor and up the eastern wall, a drastically different rock composition prevailed. These areas were made up of mica schist, severely laminated, cross-faulted in many regions, and interspersed with talc. So basically nothing that you would want to build a dam on. So he looked at it, and at first he was like, meh. But he still surveyed the area and took it into consideration. Although later many geologists disagreed on the exact location of the area of contact between the two formations, a majority opinion placed it at the inactive San Francisco fault line. Holland ordered exploratory tunnels and shafts excavated into the red conglomerate hillside to determine its characteristics. He also had water percolation tests performed. The results convinced him that the hill would make a satisfactory abutment for a dam, should the need ever arise. A surprising aspect of the early geologic exploration came later when the need for a dam arose. Although Holland wrote of the precarious nature of the face of the schist on the eastern side of the canyon in his annual report to the Board of Public Works in 1911, it was either misjudged or ignored by the construction supervisor of St. Francis Dam, Stanley Dunham. Dunham testified at the coroner's inquest that tests he had ordered yielded results that showed the rock to be hard and of the exact nature throughout the entire area, which became the eastern abutment. His opinion was that this area was more than suitable for the construction of the dam. The population continued increasing rapidly. By 1920, there were 576,673 souls occupying the Los Angeles area. This unexpected rapid growth brought a demand for a larger water supply. Between 1920 and 1926, 7 smaller reservoirs were built, and modifications were made to raise the height of its largest, the Lower San Fernando, by 7 feet. But the need for a still more extensive reservoir was clear. Initially, this new large reservoir's planned site was in Big Tujunga Canyon, above the city now known as Sunland, in the northeast portion of the San Fernando Valley. Still, the high value placed on the ranches and private land which would be needed were, in Holland's view, an attempted hold-up of the city. Accordingly, he ceased his attempts at purchasing those lands and renewed his interest in the area he had explored 12 years earlier, the federally owned and far less expensive private land in San Francisco Canyon. Surveying the area and determining the location for St. Francis Dam began in December of 1922. Clearing the site and construction began quietly to help minimize attention to the project by angry farmers and landowners of the Owens Valley. The Los Angeles Aqueduct had become the target of frequent sabotage, and the city was eager to avoid any repeat of these expensive and time-consuming repairs. Basically, when they put the aqueduct in and they started routing water to LA, they were just stealing all the water. So these people were beyond pissed. It was affecting everything in the Owens Valley. Everything. Agriculture, everything. It was completely drying up Owens Valley. And these people were not happy, not even a little. So St. Francis Dam, it was often described as curved, but it was more arched. Unfortunately, the science of gravity arch design, which is a common dam design nowadays was not quite fully understood at this point. Annually, the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply and the ancillary departments reported to the Board of Public Service Commissioners on the prior fiscal year's activities. We know that the preliminary studies of the area that became the dam site and topographical surveys for the St. Francis Reservoir and Dam were completed by June of 1923. They called for a dam built to the elevation of 1,825 feet above sea level, 175 feet above the stream bed base. These early calculations for a reservoir created by the dam revealed it would have a capacity of approximately 30,000 acre-feet. Oh, that's a lot. Or about 9,775,542,857 gallons of water. On July 1st, 1924, the same day Holland was to submit his annual report to the Board of Public Service Commissioners, Office Engineer W.W. Hurlbut informed him that all of the preliminary work on the dam had been completed. In his report presented to the board, Holland wrote that the reservoir's capacity would be 32,000 acre-feet. Hurlbut, who also presented the board with his annual report, reported a report of the office engineer, clarified this change from the prior year's estimate. In a statement, he wrote that at the St. Francis Reservoir, the dam site had been cleared and the foundation trench started. All concrete placing equipment had been contracted for, and its expected actual work of pouring the concrete will start in approximately 90 days. Additional topographic surveys have been completed and disclosed a storage capacity of 32,000 acre-feet at elevation 1,825 feet above sea level. So that's 2,000 acre-feet more than was originally intended. Construction of the dam began 5 weeks later. The first concrete was poured in early August. In March 1925, before Holland's report to the Board of Public Service Commissioners, Office Engineer Hurlbut again reported to Holland on the St. Francis Dam and reservoir progress. There was a change of plans with a proposed increase of an additional 10 feet in height. In all, there ended up being 2 height increases totaling 20 feet and increasing the volume of the dam by approximately 6,000 acre-feet total. When completed on May 4th, 1926, the stair-step-faced dam rose to 185 feet above the canyon floor. Both faces leading up to the crest were vertical for the final 23 feet. The steep section was fashioned into 24-foot wide areas on the downstream face. A portion of these made up the spillway, which consisted of 11 panels divided into 2 groups. Each spillway section had an open area of 18 inches high and 20 feet wide for the overflow to pass. The dam also had 5 30-inch diameter outlet pipes through the center section, controlled by slide gates attached to the upstream face. A distinctive aspect of St. Francis Dam was its stepped-down stream face. While the height of each step was a constant 5 feet, the width of each step was unique to its respective elevation above sea level. This width varied between 5.5 feet near the streambed base at 1,650 feet and decreased to 1.45 feet at an elevation of 1,816 feet at the bottom of the spillways and vertical panels. Water began to fill the reservoir on March 12, 1926. It rose steadily and rather uneventfully, although several temperature and contraction cracks did appear in the dam, and a minor amount of seepage began to flow under the abutments. In accordance with design protocol, which had been established by the engineering department during the construction of the Holland Dam, no contraction joints were incorporated. The most notable incidents were 2 vertical cracks that ran down to the dam from the top. One was approximately 58 feet west of the outlet gates and another about the same distance to the east. Holland, along with his assistant chief engineer and general manager Harvey Van Norman, inspected the cracks and leaks and judged them to be within expectation for a concrete dam the size of St. Francis. It's terrifying. At the beginning of April, the water level reached the inactive San Francisco fault line in the western abutment. Some seepage began almost immediately as the water covered this area. Workers were ordered to seal off the leak, but they were not entirely successful, and water continued to permeate through the face of the dam. A 2-inch pipe was used to collect this seepage and was laid from the fault line down to the home of the dam keeper, Tony Harnischfager, which he used for domestic purposes. Water collected in the drainage pipes under the dam to relieve the hydrostatic uplift pressure was carried off in this manner. In April of 1927, the reservoir level was brought to within 10 feet of the spillway, and during most of May, the water level was within 3 feet of overflowing. There were no considerable changes in the amount of seepage collected, and month after month, the pipe flowed about 1/3 full. This was an insignificant amount for a dam the size of St. Francis, and on this subject Holland said, "Of all the dams I've built, and of all the dams I've ever seen, it was the driest dam of its size I'd ever seen." The seepage data recorded during the 1926 to 27 period shows that the dam was exceptionally dry. On May 27th, the problems in the Owens Valley escalated once again with the dynamiting of a large section of the Los Angeles aqueduct. A second incident took place a few days later, which destroyed another large area. In the days that followed, several more sections of the aqueduct were dynamited, which caused a complete interruption of the flow. The near-full reservoir behind St. Francis Dam was the only water source from the north, and withdrawals began immediately. During this time, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department received an anonymous phone call that a carload of men was on the way from Inyo County intending to dynamite St. Francis Dam and to get some officers on the way as quick as possible. Within minutes, all bureaus of water power and light and waterworks and supply personnel, either working or residing within the canyon, had been notified. Cars carrying dozens of officers from both the LA Police and Sheriff's Department rushed to the area. However, no sign of the threat materialized. The daily record of high water elevations of the St. Francis Dam shows that between May 27th and June 30th alone, 7,000 to 8,000 acre-feet of water was withdrawn. Through June and July, the Owens Valley fight continued, as did interruptions in the flow from the aqueduct. This, in turn, caused continued withdrawals from the reservoir. In early August, opposition to Los Angeles' water projects collapsed after the indictment of its leaders for embezzlement. The city subsequently sponsored a series of repair and maintenance programs for aqueduct facilities that stimulated local employment. Once again, the St. Francis Reservoir level rose, although not without incident. Late in the year, a fracture was noticed, which began at the western abutment and ran diagonally upwards and toward the center section for a distance. As with others, Holland inspected it, judged it to be another contraction crack, and ordered it filled with oakum and grouted to seal off any seepage. At the same time, another fracture appeared in a corresponding position on the eastern portion of the dam, starting at the crest near the last spillway section and running downward at an angle for 65 feet before ending at the hillside. It, too, was sealed in the same manner. These fractures were wider at their junction with the hillside abutments and narrowed as they angled toward the top of the dam. The reservoir continued to rise steadily until early February 1928, when the water level was brought to within 1 foot of the spillway. During this time, though, several new cracks appeared in the wing dike added to help accommodate the increase in height, and new areas of seepage began from under both abutments. Near the end of February, a notable leak began at the base of the wing dike, approximately 150 feet west of the main dam. It discharged about 0.6 cubic feet per second, which is about 4.5 U.S. gallons per second, or 17 liters. Holland inspected it, judged it to be another contraction or temperature crack, and left it open to drain. However, during the first week of March, it was noticed that the leak had approximately doubled. Due to some erosion taking place, Holland ordered an 8-inch concrete drain pipe to be installed. The line led the water along the dike wall, discharging it at the west abutment contact with the main dam. This gave the hillside a very saturated appearance, and the water was flowing down the steps of the dam where it abutted the hill, caused alarm among the canyon residents and others traveling on the road, 700 feet to the east, as at that distance it appeared the water was coming from the abutment. Finally, on March 7, 1928, the reservoir was 3 inches below the spillway crest, and Holland ordered that no more water to be turned into St. Francis. On March 12th, while conducting his usual inspection of the dam keeper discovered a new leak on the west abutment, concerned not only because other leaks had appeared in the same area in the past, but more so that the muddy color of the runoff he observed could indicate the water was eroding the dam's foundation. He immediately alerted Holland. After arriving, both Holland and Van Norman began inspecting the area of the leak. By following the runoff, Van Norman found the source and determined that the cloudy appearance of the water was not from the leak itself, but came from where the water contacted loose soil from a newly cut access road. The leak was discharging 2 to 3 cubic feet, 57 to 85 liters, 15 to 22 U.S. gallons per second of water by their approximation. Indeed, their concern was heightened, not only given its location, but more so in that, at times, the volume being discharged was inconsistent. They later testified at the coroner's inquest. Twice as they watched, an acceleration or surging of the flow was noticed by both men. Holland felt that some corrective measures were needed, although this could be done sometime in the future. Holland, Van Norman, and Hardenfinger, I'm so sorry, I cannot say that name, inspected the dam and various leaks and seepages for the next 2 hours, finding nothing out of the ordinary or of concern for a large dam. Finally, with both Mulholland and Van Norman convinced that the new leak was not dangerous and the dam was safe, they returned to Los Angeles. 2.5 minutes before midnight on March 12, 1928, St. Francis Dam catastrophically failed. There were no surviving eyewitnesses to the collapse, but at least 5 people passed the dam less than an hour before, and none of them noticed anything unusual. The last of those people, Ace Hopewell, a carpenter at Powerhouse No. 1, rode his motorcycle past the dam about 10 minutes before midnight. He testified at the coroner's inquest that he had passed Powerhouse No. 2 without seeing anything there or at the dam that caused him any concern. He stated that at approximately 1.5 miles upstream, he heard, above his motorcycle's engine noise, a rumbling much like the sound of rocks rolling on the hill. He stopped and got off, leaving the engine idling, and smoked a cigarette while checking the hillside above him. The rumble that had caught his attention earlier had begun to fade behind him. Assuming that it might have been a landslide, as these were common in this area, and satisfied that he was in no danger, he continued. At the Bureau of Power and Light, both receiving stations in Los Angeles, and the waterworks and supply at Powerhouse No. 1, a sharp voltage drop happened at 11:57 p.m. Simultaneously, a transformer at Southern California Edison's Saugus substation exploded. A situation investigators later determined it was caused by wires up the western hillside of San Francisco Canyon, about 90 feet above the dam's east abutment shoring. Given the known height of the flood wave and within 70 minutes or less after the collapse, the reservoir was virtually empty. Thus, the failure must have been sudden and complete. After it began, little of what had been the dam remained standing, other than the center section and wing wall. From west of the center section to the wing wall abutment atop the hillside, the main dam broke into several large pieces and numerous smaller pieces. These were washed downstream as 12.4 billion gallons of water began surging down San Francisco Canyon. The most significant part, weighing approximately 10,000 tons, was found about 3/4 of a mile below the dam site. Similarly, the dam portion east of the center section had also broken into several larger and smaller pieces. Unlike the western side, most of these ended up lying near the base of the vertical section. The most significant fragments fell across the lower portion of the vertical section, coming to rest partially on its upstream face. Initially, the 2 remaining areas of the dam remained upright. As the reservoir lowered, water undercut the already undermined eastern portion, which twisted and fell back toward the east hillside, breaking into 3 sections. The dam keeper and his family were most likely among the first casualties caught in the initially 140-foot-high flood wave, which swept over the cottage about 1/4 of a mile downstream from the dam. The body of a woman who lived with the family was found fully clothed and wedged between 2 blocks of concrete near the dam's house. This led to the suggestion she and the dam keeper may have been inspecting the structure immediately before its failure. However, neither his nor his 6-year-old son's body was ever found. 5 minutes after the collapse, the then 120-foot flood wave had traveled 1.5 miles at an average speed of 18 miles per hour, destroying the heavy concrete Powerhouse No. 2 and taking the lives of 64 of the 67 workmen and their families who lived nearby. This cut power to much of Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley. It was quickly restored via tie lines with Southern California Edison Company. Still, as the floodwater entered the Santa Clara riverbed, it overflowed the river's banks, flooding parts of present-day Valencia and Newhall. At about 12:40 a.m., Southern California Edison's 2 main lines into the city were destroyed by the flooding, redarkening the areas that had earlier lost power and spreading the outage to other areas served by Southern California Edison. Nonetheless, power to most regions not flooded was restored with power from Edison's Long Beach Steam Electric Generating Plant. Near 1 a.m., the mass of water, then 55 feet high, followed the riverbed west and demolished Edison's Saugus substation, cutting power to the entire Santa Clara River Valley, Ventura, and Oxnard. In addition, at least 4 miles of the state's main north-south highway were underwater, and the town of Castiac Junction was being washed away. The flood entered the Santa Clarita Valley at 12 miles per hour, approximately 5 miles downstream near the Ventura-Los Angeles County line. A temporary construction camp the Edison Company had set up for its 150-man crew on the flats of the riverbank was hit. Edison personnel had been unable to issue a warning with all the confusion, and 84 workers perished. Shortly before 1:30 a.m., A Santa Clara River Valley telephone operator learned from the Pacific Long Distance Telephone Company that the dam had failed. She called a California Highway Patrol officer, then began calling the homes of those in danger. The CHP officer went from door to door, warning residents about the imminent flood. At the same time, a deputy sheriff drove up the river valley toward the flood with his sirens blaring until he had to stop at Fillmore. The flood heavily damaged Fillmore, Bardesdale, and Santa Paula before emptying both victims and debris into the Pacific Ocean 54 miles downstream, south of Ventura, at what is now the West Montalvo oil field around 5:30 a.m. At that point, the wave was almost 2 miles wide and still traveling at 6 miles per hour. Newspapers across the country carried accounts of the disaster. The front page of the Los Angeles Times ran 4 stories, including aerial photos of the collapsed dam and the city of Santa Paula. A Times Flood Relief Fund was set up to receive donations, mirrored by similar efforts by other publications. In a statement, Holland said, "I would not venture at this time to express a positive opinion as to the cause of the St. Francis Dam disaster. Mr. Van Norman and I arrived at the scene of the break around 2:30 a.m. this morning. We saw at once the dam was completely out, and the torrential flood of water from the reservoir had left an appalling record of death and destruction in the valley below." Mulholland stated it appeared that there had been significant movement in the hills forming the western buttress of the dam. 3 eminent geologists, Robert T. Hill, C.F. Tolman, and D.W. Murphy, were hired by the Board of Water and Power Commissioners to determine if this was the cause. It was noted that no tremors had been reported at seismograph stations, ruling out an earthquake as the cause of the break. There were at least a dozen separate investigations into the collapse. With unprecedented speed, 8 studies began by the weekend following the collapse, almost all involving investigative panels of prominent engineers and geologists. The more notable of these groups and committees were those sponsored by California Governor C.C. Young, headed by A.J. Wiley, the renowned dam engineer and consultant to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation's Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam Board. The Los Angeles City Council, which was chaired by the chief of the Reclamation Service, Elwood Mead, the Los Angeles County Coroner, Frank Nance, and Los Angeles County District Attorney, Asa Keys. Others were convened. The Water and Power Commissioners started their own inquiry, as did the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, who hired J.B. Lippincott. The Santa Clara River Protective Association employed the geologist and Stanford University professor emeritus Dr. Bailey Willis, and eminent San Francisco civil engineer and past president of the American Society of Civil Engineers, Carl E. Grunsky. Others, such as the Railroad Commission and several political entities, only sent investigators or representatives. Although they were not unanimous on all points, most commissions quickly reached their respective conclusions. The Governor's Commission met on March 19th and submitted their 79-page report to the governor on March 24th, 5 days later and only 11 days after the early morning March 13 flood. Although this may have been sufficient time to answer what they had been directed to determine, they had been deprived of the sworn testimony at the coroner's inquest scheduled to be convened on March 21st, the only inquiry that considered factors other than geology and engineering. The need for nearly immediate answers was understandable, having its roots in the Swing-Johnson bill in Congress. This bill, first filed in 1922 and failed to be voted on in 3 successive Congresses, was again before Congress at the time. This bill ultimately provided the funding for constructing the Hoover Dam. Supporters and responsible leaders alike realized the jeopardy in which the bill then stood. Although the water and electricity from the project were needed, the idea of the construction of such a massive dam of similar design, which would create a reservoir 700 times larger than St. Francis, did not sit well with many in light of the recent disaster and devastation. The bill was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Coolidge on December 21, 1928. The Governor's Commission was the first to release its findings, titled Report of the Commission appointed by Governor C.C. Young to investigate the causes leading to the failure of the St. Francis Dam near Saugus, California. The report became the most widely distributed analysis. Along with most other investigators, they perceived this new leak as the key to understanding the collapse. However, the Commission believed that the foundation under the entire dam left very much to be desired. The report stated, with such a formation, the ultimate failure of this dam was inevitable unless water could have been kept from reaching the foundation. Inspection galleries, pressure grouting, drainage wells, and deep cutoff walls are commonly used to prevent or remove percolation. Still, it is improbable that any or all of these devices would have been adequately effective, though they would have ameliorated the conditions and postponed the final failure. They placed the cause of the failure on the western hillside. The west end, the commission stated, was founded upon a reddish conglomerate which, even when dry, was of decidedly inferior strength, and which, when wet, became so soft that most of it lost almost all rock-like characteristics. The softening of the reddish conglomerate undermined the west side. The rush of water released by the failure of the west end caused a heavy scour against the easterly canyon wall and caused the failure of that part of the structure. There then quickly followed the collapse of large sections of the dam. The committee appointed by Los Angeles City Council concurred in attributing the collapse to defective foundations. They wrote, "The manner of failure was that the first leak, however, started under the concrete at that part of the dam that stood on the red conglomerate. This leak increased in volume as it scoured away the foundation material already greatly softened by infiltrated water from the reservoir. Removing the support of the dam at this point, no arch action could occur because of the yielding conglomerate abutment, making the failure of the dam inevitable." Likewise, they concluded the failure most likely followed a pattern similar to that proposed by the Governor's Commission. However, they did acknowledge that the sequence of failure is uncertain. The committee ended the report with, "Having examined all the evidence which it has been able to obtain to date, reports its conclusions as follows. The type and dimensions of the dam were amply sufficient if based on a suitable foundation. The concrete which the dam was comprised of had ample strength to resist the stresses it would typically be subjected to. The failure cannot be laid at the movement of the Earth's crust. The dam failed as a result of defective foundations. This failure reflects in no way the stability of a well-designed gravity dam properly founded on suitable bedrock." The consensus of most of the investigating commissions was that the initial break had taken place at or near the fault line on the western abutment, which had been a problem area since water was first brought into and covered the area. The prevailing thought was that increasing water percolation through the fault line had either undermined or weakened the foundation to the point that a portion of the structure blew out or the dam collapsed from its own immense weight. This was supported by a chart made by the automatic water level recorder located on the dam's center section. This chart clearly showed that there had been no significant change in the reservoir level until 40 minutes before the dam's failure, at which time a small, though gradually increasing loss was recorded. Unfortunately, this controversial item turned out to be another area in which the investigating bodies were handicapped from lacking the information that was later brought to light in the testimony at the coroner's inquest, which was the only investigation that took evidence other than engineering and geology into account. The only theory to vary significantly from the others was that of Bailey Willis, Carl E. Grunsky, and his son. They believed that the portion of the east abutment below the dam was the first to give way, clearing the way for the collapse to occur. Their investigations, while somewhat collaborative, culminated in two separate reports, one by the Grunskys and the other by Dr. Willis, which were completed in April 1928 and, according to Carl Grunsky, were reached independently and are in substantial agreement. Dr. Willis and the Grunskys agreed with the other engineers and investigators about the entire foundation's poor quality and deteriorating conditions. However, they maintained that a critical situation developed on the east abutment. Dr. Willis, the geologist of the investigative team, was most likely the first to discover the old landslide within the mountains which had made the eastern abutment for the dam. In his report, he discussed it at great length, and the Grunskys drew substantially on it, as they did his analysis of the schist for their own report. The Grunskys, as civil engineers, took the lead in that area of the investigation and described the role played by hydrostatic uplift. Uplift takes its name from its tendency to lift a dam upward. Although many designers and builders of dams had become aware of this phenomenon by the late 1890s to early 1900s, it was still not generally understood or appreciated. Nevertheless, it was becoming a matter of debate and a concern to dam builders of this era that water from a reservoir could seep under a dam and exert pressure upward, due, for the most part, to inadequate drainage of the base and side abutments. The phenomenon of uplift destabilizes gravity dams by reducing the structure's effective weight, making it less able to resist horizontal water pressure. In addition, uplift can act through the bedrock foundation. The condition most commonly develops where the bedrock foundation is strong enough to bear the dam's weight, but is fractured or fissured and susceptible to seepage and water saturation. According to their theories, water from the reservoir had permeated far back into the schist formation of the eastern abutment. This lubricated the rock and slowly began to move, exerting a tremendous amount of weight against the dam. According to the Grunskys, it was already becoming less stable due to uplift, making the situation worse. Dr. Willis established was that the conglomerate on which the western abutment of the dam rested reacted upon becoming wet by swelling. In fact, the amount of swelling was such that it would raise any structure built on it. This hypothesis was reinforced when surveys were taken after the failure compared with those taken when first made. They revealed that in some areas the wall was 2 to 6 inches higher than when built. Therefore, the dam was caught between forces acting on it much like a vice, as the red conglomerate swelled on one side and the moving mountain pressed in on it from another. In his report, Grunsky concluded, as soon as the dam was loosened on its base, the toe of the structure spalled off. This was probably the beginning of its breaking up and probably occurred sometime after 11:30 p.m., during the 23 minutes in which the water in the reservoir apparently fell 0.3 of a foot. Thereupon, quite likely, a part of the east end of the dam, meanwhile undermined, went out, and the dam at this end lost its hillside support. Hydrostatic uplift at the already loose west and the weight of the remaining portion of the undermined east caused a temporary tilting of the dam toward the east, accompanied by a rapid washing away of the hillside under the dam at its west end, which then also began to break up. The reservoir water was rushing with tremendous force against both ends of the upstream face of what was still standing of the dam. This rush of water carried away huge blocks of concrete from both ends of the dam. There was and remains a difference of professional opinions on the amount of time that elapsed, shown by the chart made by the Stevens automatic water level recorder, from when the line indicating the reservoir level broke sharply downward until it became perpendicular. Most investigating engineers feel the amount of time shown on the chart is 30 to 40 minutes, not the 23 minutes Grunsky stated. In support of his theory of the dam tilting, Grunsky pointed to an odd clue near the western lower edge of the vertical section. Here, a ladder had become wedged in a crack that had opened apparently during this rocking or tilting process, and then had become tightly pinched in place as the section settled back into its foundation. Measurements taken proved the crack must have been much wider at the time that the ladder entered it. Further, surveys indeed showed the center section had been subjected to severe tilting or twisting. These surveys established the center section had moved 5.5 inches downstream and 6 inches toward the eastern abutment. Although this investigation was insightful and informative, the theory, which hypothesized an appreciably increasing amount of seepage just before the failure, becomes less likely when it's compared against the eyewitness accounts of the conditions in the canyon and near the dam during the last 30 minutes before its collapse. In addition, Grunsky hypothesized, though failed to explain, the action of the dam tilting as he described. This action would have had the dam in motion as a singular unit. Conversely, the coroner's inquest testimony indicates that the dam was fractured transversely in at least 4 places. Furthermore, the 2 cracks, which bordered each side of the standing center section, would have served as hinges to prevent this. The center section, which had become known as the Tombstone due to a newspaper reporter's description of it as such, became an attraction for tourists and souvenir hunters. In May 1929, the upright section was toppled with dynamite, and the remaining blocks were demolished with bulldozers and jackhammers to discourage the sightseers and souvenir hunters from exploring the ruins. The wing dike was used by Los Angeles firemen to gain experience in using explosives on building structures. St. Francis Dam was not rebuilt, though Bouquet Reservoir in nearby Bouquet Canyon was built in 1934 as a replacement. The exact number of victims remains unknown. The official death toll in August 1928 was 385, but the remains of victims continued to be discovered every few years until at least the mid-1950s. Many victims were swept out to sea when the flood reached the Pacific Ocean and never recovered, while others were washed ashore, some as far south as the Mexican border. The remains of one victim were found deep underground near Newhall in 1992, and other bodies, believed to be victims of the disaster, were found in the late 1970s and 1994. The death toll is currently estimated to be at least 431. At the coroner's inquest, the leak Tony Harnsfager spotted was cited as evidence that the dam was leaking on the day of the break, and that both the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply and Holland were aware of it. Holland told the jury he had been at the dam the day of the break due to the dam keeper's call, but neither he nor Van Norman had observed anything of concern nor found any dangerous conditions. Mulholland further testified that leaks in dams, especially of the type and size of St. Francis, were common. During the inquest, Mulholland said, "This inquest is an excruciating thing for me to have to attend, but it is the occasion of it that is painful. The only ones I envy about this thing are the ones who are dead." In subsequent testimony, after answering a question, he added, "Whether it is good or bad, don't blame anyone else. You just fasten it on me. If there was an error in human judgment, I was the human. I won't try to fasten it on anyone else." The coroner's inquest jury determined one of the causative factors for the disaster was what they termed as an error in engineering judgment in determining the foundation at the St. Francis Dam site and deciding on the best type of dam to build there. and the responsibility for the error in engineering judgment rests upon the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply and the chief engineer thereof. They cleared Mulholland and the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply of any criminal culpability, since neither he nor anyone else could have known the instability of rock formations on which the dam was built. The hearings also recommended that the construction and operation of a great dam should never be left to the sole judgment of one man, no matter how eminent. Mulholland retired from the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply on December 1, 1928. His assistant, Harvey Van Norman, succeeded him as chief engineer and general manager. Mulholland was retained as chief consulting engineer, receiving a salary of $500 a month. In later years, he retreated into a life of semi-isolation. Mulholland died in 1935 at the age of 79. In response to the St. Francis Dam disaster, the California legislature created an updated dam safety program and eliminated the municipal exemption. Before this was added, a municipality having its own engineering department was entirely exempt from regulation. On August 14, 1929, the Department of Public Works, under the administrative oversight of the state engineer, which was later assumed by the Division of Safety of Dams, was given authority to review all non-federal dams over 25 feet high or which could hold more than 50 acre-feet of water. The new legislation also allowed the state to employ consultants as they deemed necessary. Additionally, the state was given full authorities to supervise the maintenance and operation of all non-federal dams. Having determined that the unregulated design of construction projects constituted a hazard to the public, the California legislature passed law to regulate civil engineering. In 1929, the State Board of Registration for Civil Engineers, now the Board for Professional Engineers, Land Surveyors, and Geologists, was created. The dam's failure is now believed to have begun with the dam's eastern abutment, possibly due to a landslide. Having its roots in works by Willis and Grunsky, this scenario was expanded upon by the author Charles Outland in his book Man-Made Disaster, The Story of St. Francis Dam, published in 1963. The material of the eastern abutment of the dam was built on might have been part of an ancient landslide. It would have been impossible for geologists of the 20s to have detected that. Indeed, the site had been inspected twice at different times by two of the leading geologists and civil engineers of the day, John C. Banner of Stanford University and Carl E. Grunsky, but neither found fault with the San Francisco rock. J. David Rogers, inspired by work of Outland, investigated the failure and published an extensive scenario, albeit somewhat controversial, of the possible geological and rock mechanic actions which may have led to the dam's collapse. He attributed the failure to three significant factors: the instability of the ancient landslide material on which the dam was built, the failure to compensate for the additional height added to the dam's design, and the design and construction being overseen by only one person. A critique of Rogers' historical analysis of the dam's collapse was published in the Journal of California History in 2004 by Norris Hundley Jr. from UCLA and Donald C. Jackson, professor at Lafayette College. While accepting most of his geological analysis of the failure, the article clarifies the differences and deficiencies of the structure built in San Francisco Canyon and how it fell short of the standards for large-scale concrete gravity dams as practiced by other prominent dam engineers in the 1920s. Shortly after the disaster, many living below Mulholland Dam, which creates the Hollywood Reservoir, feared a similar tragedy. They began to protest and petitioned Los Angeles to drain the reservoir and remove the dam. A committee of engineers and geologists to assess Mulholland Dam was appointed to evaluate the dam's safety. An external review panel to assess the structure, convened by the state of California, followed in 1930. The same year, the City of Los Angeles Board of Water and Power Commissioners appointed their own board of review for the dam. Although the state's panel did not recommend modification of the dam, both panels came to similar conclusions. The dam lacked what was then considered sufficient uplift relief, which could lead to destabilization and was unacceptable. Again in 1931, a fourth panel, the Board of Engineers to evaluate Mulholland Dam, was appointed to assess the structure. An external study group appointed by the Board of Water and Power Commissioners produced a geological report of the suitability of foundations. Certain design deficiencies were uncovered in the plans made by the engineering department during the planning phase of the dam. These had to do with the dam's base width and its ability to resist uplift and sliding without and be able to withstand earthquake loading. The decision was made to permanently keep the Hollywood Reservoir drawn down. It was also decided to keep the reservoir level at no more than 4,000 acre-feet and to place an enormous amount of earth, 330,000 cubic yards, on the dam's downstream face to increase its resistance against hydroelectric uplift, earthquake forces, and to screen it from public view. This work was carried out in 1933 and 1934. The only visible remains of St. Francis Dam are weathered, broken chunks of gray concrete and the rusted remnants of the handrails that line the top of the dam and the wing dike. The ruins and the scar from the ancient landslide can be seen from San Francisco Canyon Road. Large chunks of debris can still be found scattered about the creek bed south of the dam's original site. The site of the disaster is registered as California Historical Landmark number 919. The landmark is located at Powerhouse number 2 and is near San Francisco Canyon Road. The marker reads, number 919, St. Francis Dam Disaster Site. The 185-foot concrete St. Francis Dam, part of the Los Angeles Aqueduct System, stood a mile and a half north of this spot. On March 12, 1928, it collapsed and sent over 12 billion gallons of water roaring down the Santa Clara River Valley just before midnight. Over 450 lives were lost in this, one of California's most significant disasters. San Francisco Canyon Road sustained heavy storm damage in 2005, and when rebuilt in 2009, it was rerouted away from the original roadbed and the remains of the main section of the dam. The new road is routed through a cut made in the hillside on the western edge of the wing dike. The John D. Dingle Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act, signed March 12, 2019, authorized the establishment of the St. Francis Dam Disaster National Memorial and established the St. Francis Dam Disaster National Monument. The sites are administered by the United States Forest Service within Angeles National Forest to commemorate the dam's collapse and preserve 353 acres of land for recreation and resource protection. The St. Francis Dam National Memorial Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization established in 2019. The main goal is to raise funds to support the United States Forest Service in building and maintaining the St. Francis Dam Disaster National Memorial Monument, including constructing a visitor center and a memorial wall with the names of all the victims. Well, they can't really name all of the victims. There were actually a lot of people that weren't identified, and a lot of the reason for not having a solid body count was many of the workers were undocumented from Mexico, and they had no, record of a lot of the people that were there. So anyway, kind of a bummer story, but one that needs to be told. A lot of people lost their lives senselessly, and it was a big tragedy, and it really, put a big mark on the beginnings of Los Angeles. But there it is. So if you're ever out in California and you get an opportunity to go and do a little driving around and check it out, there's none of the original dam still stands there. There is a lot of rubble and things like that, but they do have the Powerhouse 2 set up with a little bit of a memorial site and things. Anyway, I'm going to head out of here, so be sure to look for our podcast every week. I usually upload on Wednesdays, sometimes Thursdays, depending on the length of the episode and what I have going on. And I have yet to decide what I'm going to talk about next week, what state. If you have any suggestions of a state you would like to hear about, please reach out to me on Instagram or Facebook or, the places. Do the thing. And I also have a YouTube channel set up, Twisted States, of course. So you can even reach out to me there, comment on one of my videos or whatever. I will get the notification and check it. And please be sure to join me next week as we continue to explore all 50 of the U.S.'s twisted states. Thank you, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.